Chapter 12b. The Kingdom of God is Within You. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by David Shutt. The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. They cannot imagine that the leaders of civilization, the educated classes, could so confidently preach two such opposed principles as the law of Christ and murder. A simple, uncorrupted youth cannot imagine that those who stand so high in his opinion, whom he regards as holy or learned men, could for any object whatever mislead him so shamefully. But this is just what has always been and always is done to him. It is done, number one, by instilling, by example and direct instruction, from childhood up into the working people, who have not time to study moral and religious questions for themselves. The idea that torture and murder are compatible with Christianity, and that for certain objects of state, torture and murder are not only admissible, but ought to be employed. And two, by instilling into certain of the people, who have either voluntarily enlisted or been taken by compulsion into the army, the idea that the perpetration of murder and torture on their own hands is a sacred duty and even a glorious exploit, worthy of praise and reward. The general delusion is diffused among all people by means of the catechisms or books, which nowadays replace them in use for the compulsory education of children. In them it is stated that violence, that is, imprisonment and execution, as well as murder in civil or foreign war in the defense and maintenance of the existing state organization, whatever that may be, absolute or limited monarchy, convention, consulate, empire of this or that, Napoleon or Bollinger, constitutional monarchy, commune, or republic, is absolutely lawful and not opposed to morality and Christianity. This is stated in all catechisms or books used in schools, and men are so thoroughly persuaded of it that they grow up, live, and die in that conviction without once entertaining a doubt about it. This is one form of deception, the general deception instilled into everyone, but there is another special deception practiced upon the soldiers or police who are picked out by one means or another to do the torturing and murdering necessary to defend and maintain the existing regime. In all military instructions there appears in one form or another what is expressed in the Russian military code in the following words. Article 87. To carry out exactly and without comment the orders of a superior officer means to carry out an order received from a superior officer exactly without considering whether it is good or not, and whether it is possible to carry it out. The superior officer is responsible for the consequences of the order he gives. Article 88. The subordinate ought never to refuse to carry out the orders of a superior officer except when he sees clearly that in carrying out his superior officer's command, he breaks the law of God. One involuntarily expects, not at all, his oath of fidelity and allegiance to the Tsar. It is here said that the man who is a soldier can and ought to carry out all the orders of his superior without exception, and as these orders for the most part involve murder, it follows that he ought to break all the laws of God and man. The one law he may not break is that of fidelity and allegiance to the man who happens, at a given moment, to be in power. Precisely the same thing is said in other words in all codes of military instruction. And it could not be otherwise, since the whole power of the army and the state is based in reality on this delusive emancipation of men from their duty to God and their conscience, and the substitution of duty to their superior officer for all other duties. This, then, is the foundation of the belief of the lower classes, that the existing regime so fatal for them is the regime which ought to exist, and which they ought, therefore, to support, even by torture and murder. This belief is founded on a conscious deception practiced on them by the higher classes, and it cannot be otherwise, to compel the lower classes, which are more numerous, to oppress and ill-treat themselves, even at the cost of actions opposed to their conscience. It was necessary to deceive them, and it has been done accordingly. Not many days ago, I saw once more this shameless deception being openly practiced, and once more I marveled that it could be practiced so easily and impudently. At the beginning of November, as I was passing through Tula, I saw once again at the gates of the Zemsky courthouse the crowd of peasants I had so often seen before, and heard the drunken shouts of the men mingled with the pitiful lamentations of their wives and mothers. It was the recruiting session. I can never pass by the spectacle. It attracts me by a kind of fascination of repulsion. I again went into the crowd, took my stand among the peasants, looked about and asked questions. And once again I was amazed that this hideous crime can be perpetrated so easily in broad daylight and in the midst of a large town. As the custom is every year in all the villages and hamlets of the 100 millions of Russians, on the 1st of November the village elders had assembled the young men inscribed on the lists, often their own sons among them, and had brought them to the town. On the road, the recruits have been drinking without intermission, unchecked by the elders, who feel that going on such an insane errand, abandoning their wives and mothers and renouncing all they hold sacred in order to become a senseless instrument of destruction, would be too agonizing if they were not stupefied with spirits. And so they have come, drinking, swearing, singing, fighting and scuffling with one another. They have spent the night in taverns. In the morning they have slept off their drunkenness and have gathered together at the Zemsky courthouse. Some of them, in new sheepskin pelisses, with knitted scarves round their necks, their eyes swollen from drinking, are shouting wildly to one another to show their courage. Others, crowded near the door, are quietly and mournfully waiting their turn. Between their weeping wives and mothers, I had chanced upon the day of the actual enrolling, that is, the examination of those whose names are on the list. Others, meantime, were crowding into the hall of the recruiting office. Inside the office, the work was going on rapidly. The door is opened, and the guard calls, "Pyotr Sidorov." Pyotr Sidorov starts, crosses himself, and goes into a little room with a glass door, where the conscripts undress. A comrade of Pyotr Sidorov's, who has just been passed for service, and come naked out of the revision office, is dressing hurriedly, his teeth chattering. Sidorov has already heard the news, and can see from his face, too, that he has been taken. He wants to ask him questions, but they hurry him and tell him to make haste and undress. He throws off his pelisse, slips his boots over his feet, takes off his waistcoat and draws his shirt over his head, and, naked, trembling all over, and exhaling an odor of tobacco, spirits, and sweat, goes into the revision office, not knowing what to do with his brawny bare arms. Directly facing him in the revision office hangs a great gold frame, a portrait of the Tsar in full uniform with decorations, and in the corner a little portrait of Christ in a shirt and a crown of thorns. In the middle of the room is a table covered with green cloth, on which there are papers lying in a three-cornered ornament surrounded by an eagle, the zerzel. Round the table are sitting the revising officers, looking collected and indifferent. One is smoking a cigarette, another is looking through some papers. Directly Sidorov comes in, a guard goes up to him, places him under the measuring frame, raising him under his chin and straightening his legs. The man with the cigarette, he is the doctor, comes up and, without looking at the recruit's face, but somewhere beyond it, feels his body over with an air of disgust, measures him, tests him, tells the guard to open his mouth, tells him to breathe, to speak. Someone notes something down. At last, without having once looked at him in the face, the doctor says, "Right, next one," and with a weary air sits down again at the table. The soldiers again hustle and hurry the lad. He somehow gets into his trousers, wraps his feet in rags, puts on his boots, looks for his scarf and cap, and bundles his pelisse under his arm. Then they lead him into the main hall, shutting him off apart from the rest of the bench, behind which all the conscripts who have been passed for service are waiting. Another village lad, like himself, but from a distant province, now a soldier armed with a gun with a sharp-pointed bayonet at the end, keeps watch over him, ready to run him through the body if he should think of trying to escape. Meantime, the crowd of fathers, mothers, and wives, hustled by the police, are pressing round the door to hear whose lad has been taken, who is let off. One of the rejected comes out and announces that Piotr is taken, and at once a shrill cry is heard from Piotr's young wife, for whom this word, taken, means separation for 4 or 5 years, the life of a soldier's wife as a servant, often a prostitute. But here comes a man along the street with flowing hair and a particular dress, who gets out of his droshky and goes into the Zemsky courthouse. The police clear a way for him through the crowd. It is the Reverend Father come to administer the oath, and this Father, who has been persuaded that he is specially and exclusively devoted to the service of Christ, and who, for the most part, does not himself see the deception in which he lives, goes into the hall where the conscripts are waiting. He throws round him a kind of curtain of brocade, pulls his long hair out over it, opens the very gospel in which swearing is forbidden, takes the cross, the very cross on which Christ was crucified, because he would not do what this false servant of his is telling men to do, and puts them on the lectern. And all these unhappy, defenseless, and deluded lads repeat after him the lie which he utters with the assurance of familiarity. He reads, and they repeat after him, "I promise and swear by Almighty God upon his holy gospel," etc., "to defend," etc. And that is, to murder anyone I am told to, and to do everything I am told by men I know nothing of, and who care nothing for me except as an instrument for perpetrating the crimes by which they are kept in their position of power, and my brothers in their condition of misery. All the conscripts repeat these ferocious words without thinking, and then the so-called Father goes away with a sense of having correctly and conscientiously done his duty. And all these poor, deluded lads believe that these nonsensical and incomprehensible words which they have just uttered set them free for the whole time of their service from their duties as men, and lay upon them fresh and more binding duties as soldiers. And this crime is perpetrated publicly, and no one cries out to the deceiving and the deceived, "Think what you are doing. This is the basest, falsest lie by which not bodies only, but souls too, are destroyed." No one does this. On the contrary, when all have been enrolled, and they are to be let out again, the military officer goes with a confident and majestic air into the hall where the drunken, cheated lads are shut up, and cries in a bold military voice, "Your health, my lads! I congratulate you on serving the Tsar!" And they, poor fellows, someone has given them a hint beforehand, mutter awkwardly, their voices thick with drink, something to the effect that they are glad. Meantime, the crowd of fathers, mothers, and wives is standing at the doors waiting. The women keep their tearful eyes fixed on the doors. They open at last, and out come the conscripts, unsteady, but trying to put a good face on it. Here are Piotr and Vania and Makar, trying not to look their dear ones in the face. Nothing is heard but the wailing of the wives and mothers. Some of the lads embrace them and weep with them. Others make a show of courage, and others try to comfort them. The wives and mothers, knowing that they will be left for 3, 4, or 5 years without their breadwinners, weep and rehearse their woes aloud. The fathers say little. They only utter a clucking sound with their tongues and sigh mournfully, knowing that they will see no more of the steady lads they have reared and trained to help them, that they will come back not the same quiet, hard-working laborers, but for the most part conceited and demoralized, unfitted for their simple life. And then all the crowd get into their sleds again and move away down the street to the taverns and pothouses, and louder than ever sounds the medley of singing and sobbing, drunken shouts, and the wailing of the wives and mothers, the sounds of the accordeon and oaths. They all turn into the taverns, whose revenues go to the government, and the drinking bout begins, which stifles their sense of the wrong which is being done them. For 2 or 3 weeks they go on living at home, and most of that time they are jaunting, that is, drinking. On a fixed day they collect them, drive them together like a flock of sheep, and begin to train them in the military exercises and drill. Their teachers are fellows like themselves, only deceived and brutalized 2 or 3 years sooner. The means of instruction are deception, stupefaction, blows, and vodka. And before a year has passed, these good, intelligent, healthy-minded lads will be as brutal beings as their instructors. Come now, suppose your father were arrested and tried to make his escape, I asked a young soldier. I should run him through with my bayonet, he answered, with the foolish intonation peculiar to soldiers. And if he made off, I ought to shoot him, he added, obviously proud of knowing what he must do if his father were escaping. And when a good-hearted lad has been brought to a state lower than that of a brute, he is just what is wanted by those who use him as an instrument of violence. He is ready. The man has been destroyed, and a new instrument of violence has been created, and all this is done every year, every autumn, everywhere, through all Russia, in broad daylight, in the midst of large towns where all may see it, and the deception is so clever, so skillful, that though all men know the infamy of it in their hearts and see all its horrible results, they cannot throw it off and be free. When one's eyes are opened to this awful deception practiced upon us, one marvels that the teachers of the Christian religion and of morals, the instructions of youth, or even the good-hearted and intelligent parents who are to be found in every society, can teach any kind of morality in a society in which it is openly admitted, it is so admitted under all governments and all churches, that murder and torture form an indispensable element in the life of all, and that there must always be special men trained to kill their fellows, and that any one of us may have to become such a trained assassin. How can children, youths, and people generally to be taught any kind of morality, not to speak of teaching in the spirit of Christianity, side by side with the doctrine that murder is necessary for the public weal, and therefore legitimate, and that there are men of whom each of us may have to be one, whose duty it is to murder and torture and commit all sorts of crimes at the will of those who are in possession of authority. If this is so, and one can and ought to murder and torture, there is not, and cannot be, any kind of moral law, but only the law that might is right. And this is just how it is. In reality, that is, the doctrine, justified to some by the theory of the struggle for existence, which reigns in our society. And indeed, what sort of ethical doctrine could admit the legitimacy of murder for any object whatever? It is as impossible as a theory of mathematics admitting that 2 is equal to 3. There may be a semblance of mathematics admitting that 2 is equal to 3, but there can be no real science of mathematics, and there can only be a semblance of ethics in which murder in the shape of war and the execution of criminals is allowed, but no true ethics. The recognition of the life of every man as sacred is the first and only basis of all ethics. The doctrine of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth has been abrogated by Christianity because it is the justification of immorality and a mere semblance of equality and has no real meaning. Life is a value which has no weight nor size and cannot be compared to any other, and so there is no sense in destroying a life for a life. Besides, every social law aims at the amelioration of man's life. What way, then, can the annihilation of the life of some men ameliorate men's life? Annihilation of life cannot be a means of the amelioration of life. It is a suicidal act. To destroy another life for the sake of justice is as though a man, to repair the misfortune of losing one arm, should cut off the other arm for the sake of equity. But putting aside the sin of deluding men into regarding the most awful crime as a duty, putting aside the revolting sin of using the name and authority of Christ to sanction what he most condemned, not to speak of the curse on those who cause these little ones to offend, how can people who cherish their own way of life, their progress, even from the point of view of their personal security, allow the formation in their midst of an overwhelming force as senseless, cruel, and destructive as every government is organized on the basis of an army? Even the most cruel band of brigands is not so much to be dreaded as such a government. The power of every brigand chief is at least so far limited that the men of his band preserve at least some human liberty and can refuse to commit acts opposed to their conscience. But, owing to the perfection to which the discipline of the army has been brought, there is no limit to check men who form part of a regularly organized government. There are no crimes so revolting that they would not readily be committed by men who form part of a government or army at the will of anyone, such as Bollinger, Napoleon, or Pugachev, to be at their head. Often, when one sees conscription levies, military drills and maneuvers, police officers with loaded revolvers, and sentinels at their post with bayonets on their rifles, when one hears for whole days at a time, as I hear it in Helsinki where I live, the whistle of balls and the dull thud as they fall in the sand, when one sees in the midst of a town where any effort at violence and self-defense is forbidden, where the sale of powder and of chemicals, where furious driving and practicing as a doctor without a diploma and so on are not allowed, thousands of disciplined troops trained to murder and subject to one man's will, one asks oneself, how can people who prize their security quietly allow it and put up with it? Apart from the immorality and evil effects of it, nothing can possibly be more unsafe. What are people thinking about? I don't mean now Christians, ministers of religion, philanthropists, and moralists, but simply people who value their life, their security, and their comfort. This organization, we know, will work just as well in one man's hands as another. Today, let us assume power is in the hands of a ruler who can be endured, but tomorrow it may be seized by a Byron, an Elizabeth, a Catherine, a Pugachev, a Napoleon I, or a Napoleon III. And the man in authority, endurable today, may become a brute tomorrow, or may be succeeded by a mad or imbecile heir like the King of Bavaria or our Paul I. And not only the highest authorities, but all little satraps scattered over everywhere, like so many General Baranovs, governors, police officers even, and commanders of companies can perpetrate the most awful crimes before there is time for them to be removed from office. And this is what is constantly happening. One involuntarily asks, how can men let it go on? Not from higher considerations only, but from regard to their own safety. The answer to this question is that it is not all people who do tolerate it. Some, the greater proportion, deluded and submissive, have no choice and have to tolerate anything. It is tolerated by those who only under such an organization can occupy a position of profit. They tolerate it, because for them the risks of suffering from a foolish or cruel man being at the head of the government or the army are always less than the disadvantages to which they would be exposed by the destruction of the organization itself. A judge, a commander of police, a governor, or an officer will keep his position just the same under Bollinger or the Republic under Pugachev or Catherine. He will lose his profitable position for certain if the existing order of things which secured it to him is destroyed. And so, all these people feel no uneasiness as to who is at the head of the organization. They will adapt themselves to anyone. They only dread the downfall of the organization itself. And that is the reason, though often an unconscious one, that they support it. One often wonders why independent people who are not forced to do so in any way, the so-called elite of society, should go into the army in Russia, England, Germany, Austria, and even France, and seek opportunities of becoming murderers. Why do even high-principled parents send their boys to military schools? Why do mothers buy their children toy helmets, guns, and swords as playthings? The peasants' children never play at soldiers, by the way. Why do good men, and even women, who have certainly no interest in war, go into raptures over the various exploits of Skobeloff and others, and vie with one another in glorifying them? Why do men who are not obliged to do so, and get no fee for it, devote, like the marshal of Russia, whole months of toil to a business physically disagreeable and morally painful in the enrolling of conscripts? Why do all kings and emperors wear the military uniform? Why do they all hold military reviews? Why do they organize maneuvers, distribute rewards to the military, and raise monuments to generals and successful commanders? Why do rich men of independent position consider it an honor to perform a valet's duties in attendance on crowned personages, flattering them and cringing to them, and pretending to believe in their peculiar superiority? Why do men who have ceased to believe in the superstitions of the medieval church, and who could not possibly believe in them seriously and consistently, pretend to believe in and give their support to the demoralizing and blasphemous institutions of the church? Why is it that not only governments but private persons of the higher classes try so jealously to maintain the ignorance of the people? Why do they fall with such fury on any effort at breaking down religious superstitions or really enlightening the people? Why do historians, novelists, and poets, who have no hope of gaining anything by their flatteries, make heroes of kings, emperors, and conquerors of past times? Why do men who call themselves learned dedicate whole lifetimes to making theories to prove that violence employed by authority against the people is not violent at all, but a special right? One often wonders why a fashionable lady or an artist who, one would think, would take no interest in political or military questions should always condemn strikes of working people and defend war, and should always be found without hesitation opposed to the one, favorable to the other. But one no longer wonders when one realizes that in the higher classes there is an uttering instinct of what tends to maintain and of what tends to destroy the organization by virtue of which they enjoy their privileges. The fashionable lady had certainly not reasoned out that if there were no capitalists and no army to defend them, her husband would have no fortune, and she could not have her entertainments and her ball dresses. And the artist certainly does not argue that he needs the capitalists and the troops to defend them so that they may buy his pictures. But instinct, replacing reason in this instance, guides them unerringly. And it is precisely this instinct which leads all men, with few exceptions, to support all the religious, political, and economic institutions which are to their advantage. But is it possible that the higher classes support the existing order of things simply because it is to their advantage? Cannot they see that this order of things is essentially irrational, that it is no longer consistent with the stage of moral development attained by people and with public opinion, and that it is fraught with perils? The governing classes, or at least the good, honest, and intelligent people of them, cannot but suffer from these fundamental inconsistencies, and see the dangers in which they are threatened. And is it possible that all the millions of the lower classes can feel easy in conscience when they commit such obviously evil deeds as torture and murder from fear of punishment? Indeed, it could not be so. Neither the former nor the latter could fail to see the irrationality of their conduct, if the complexity of government organization did not obscure the unnatural senselessness of their actions. So many instigate, assist, or sanction the commission of every one of these actions that no one who has a hand in them feels himself morally responsible for it. It is the custom among assassins to oblige all the witnesses of a murder to strike the murdered victim, that the responsibility may be divided among as large a number of people as possible. The same principle, in different forms, is applied under the government organization in the perpetration of the crimes, without which no government organization could exist. Rulers always try to implicate as many citizens as possible in all the crimes committed in their support. Of late, this tendency has been expressed in a very obvious manner by the obligation of all citizens to take part in legal processes as jurors, in the army as soldiers, in the local government or legislative assembly as electors or members. Just as in a wicker basket, all the ends are so hidden away that it is hard to find them. In the state organization, the responsibility for the crimes committed is so hidden away that men will commit the most atrocious acts without seeing their responsibility for them. In ancient times, tyrants got credit for the crimes they committed, but in our day the most atrocious infamies, inconceivable under the Neros, are perpetrated, and no one gets blamed for them. One set of people have suggested, another set have proposed, a third have reported, a fourth have decided, a fifth have confirmed, a sixth have given the order, and a seventh set of men have carried it out. They hanged, they flogged to death women, old men and innocent people, as was done recently among us in Russia at the Yevzhinsky factory, and is always being done everywhere in Europe and America in the struggle with the anarchists and all other rebels against the existing order. They shoot and hang men by hundreds and thousands, or massacre millions in war, or break men's hearts in solitary confinement, and ruin their souls in the corruption of a soldier's life. And no one is responsible. At the bottom of the social scale, soldiers armed with guns, pistols, and sabers injure and murder people and compel men through these means to enter the army, and are absolutely convinced that the responsibility for the actions rests solely on the officers who commanded them. At the top of the scale, the czars, presidents, ministers, and parliaments decree these tortures and murders and military conscriptions, and are fully convinced that since they are either placed in authority by the grace of God or by the society they govern, which demands such decree from them, they cannot be held responsible. Between these two extremes are the intermediary personages who superintend the murders and other acts of violence, and are fully convinced that the responsibility is taken off their shoulders, partly by their superiors who have given the order, partly by the fact that such orders are expected from them by all who are at the bottom of the scale. The authority who gives the orders and the authority who executes them at the two extreme ends of the state organization meet together like the two ends of a ring. They support and rest on one another and enclose all that lies within the ring. Without the conviction that there is a person or persons who will take the whole responsibility of his acts, not one soldier would ever lift a hand to commit a murder or another deed of violence. Without the conviction that it is expected by the people, who not a single king, emperor, president, or parliament would order murders or acts of violence. Without the conviction that there are persons of a higher grade who will take the responsibility and people of a lower grade who require such acts for their welfare, not one of the intermediate classes would superintend such deeds. The state is so organized that wherever a man is placed in the social scale, his irresponsibility is the same. The higher his grade, the more he is under the influence of demands from below, and the less he is controlled by orders from above, and vice versa. All men, then, bound together by state organization, throw the responsibility of their acts on one another. The peasant soldier on the nobleman or merchant who is his officer, and the officer on the nobleman who has been appointed governor, the governor on the nobleman or son of an official who is minister, the minister on the member of the royal family who occupies the post of czar, and the czar again on all these officials, noblemen, merchants, and peasants. But that's not all. Besides the fact that men get rid of the sense of responsibility for their actions in this way, they lose their moral sense of responsibility also by the fact that in forming themselves into a state organization, they persuade themselves and each other so continually and so indefatigably that they are not all equal, but, as the stars apart, that they come to believe it genuinely themselves. Thus, some are persuaded that they are not simple people like everyone else, but special people who are to be specially honored. It is instilled into another set of men by every possible means that they are inferior to others, and therefore must submit without a murmur to every order given them by their superiors. On this inequality, above all, on the elevation of some and the degradation of others, rests the capacity men have of being blind to the insanity of the existing order of life, and all the cruelty and criminality of the deception practiced by one set of men on another. Those in whom the idea has been instilled that they are invested with a special supernatural grandeur and consequence are so intoxicated with a sense of their own imaginary dignity that they cease to feel their responsibility for what they do. While those, on the other hand, in whom the idea is fostered that they are inferior animals bound to obey their superiors in everything, fall through this perpetual humiliation into a strange condition of stupefied servility, and in this stupefied state do not see the significance of their actions and lose all consciousness of responsibility for what they do. The intermediate classes, who obey the orders of their superiors on the one hand and regard themselves as superior beings on the other, are intoxicated by power and stupefied by servility at the same time, and so lose the sense of their responsibility. One need only glance during a review at the commander-in-chief, intoxicated with self-importance, followed by his retinue, all on magnificent and gaily apparelled horses, in splendid uniforms and wearing decorations, and see how they ride to the harmonious and solemn strains of music before the ranks of soldiers, all presenting arms and petrified with servility. One need only glance at this spectacle to understand that at such moments, when they are in a state of the most complete intoxication, commander-in-chief, soldiers, and intermediate officers alike would be capable of committing crimes of which they would never dream under other conditions. The intoxication produced by such stimulants as parades, reviews, religious solemnities, and coronations is, however, an acute and temporary condition. But there are other forms of chronic, permanent intoxication to which those are liable who have any kind of authority. From that of the Tsar to that of the lowest police officer at the street corner, and also those who are in subjugation to authority and in a state of stupefied servility, the latter, like all slaves, always find a justification for their own servility in ascribing the greatest possible dignity and importance to those they serve. It is principally through this false idea of inequality and the intoxication of power and of servility resulting from it that men associated in a state organization are enabled to commit acts opposed to their conscience without the least scruple or remorse. Under the influence of this intoxication, men imagine themselves no longer simply men as they are, but some special beings. Noblemen, merchants, governors, judges, officers, czars, ministers, or soldiers, no longer bound by ordinary human duties, but by other duties far more weighty, the peculiar duties of a nobleman, merchant, governor, judge, officer, czar, minister, or soldier. Thus, the landowner who claimed the forest acted as he did only because he fancied himself not a simple man, having the same rights to life as the peasants living beside him and everyone else, but a great landowner, a member of the nobility, and under the influence of the intoxication of power, he felt his dignity offended by the peasants' claims. It was only through this feeling that, without considering the consequences that might follow, he sent in a claim to be reinstated in his pretended rights. In the same way, the judges who wrongfully adjudicated the forest to the proprietor did so simply because they fancy themselves not simply men like everyone else, and so bound to be guided in everything only by what they consider right. But under the intoxicating influence of power, imagined themselves the representatives of the justice which cannot err, while under the intoxicating influence of servility, they imagined themselves bound to carry out to the letter the instructions inscribed in a certain book, the so-called law. In the same way, all who take part in such an affair from the highest representative of authority who signs his assent to the report, from the superintendent presiding at the recruiting sessions and the priest who deludes the recruits, to the lowest soldier who is ready now to fire on his own brothers. Imagine, in the intoxication of power or of servility, that they are some conventional characters. They do not face the question that is presented to them, whether or not they ought to take part in what their conscience judges an evil act, but fancy themselves various conventional personages. One is the Tsar, God's anointed, an exceptional being called to watch over the happiness of 100 millions of men. Another is the representative of nobility, another as a priest who has received special grace by his ordination. Another is a soldier, bound by his military oath to carry out all he is commanded without reflection. Only under the intoxication of the power or the civility of their imagined positions could all these people act as they do. Were not they all firmly convinced that their representative vocations of Tsar, minister, governor, judge, nobleman, landowner, superintendent, officer, and soldier are something real and important? Not one of them would even think without horror and aversion of taking part in what they do now. The conventional positions, established hundreds of years, recognized for centuries and by everyone, distinguished by special names and dresses, and moreover confirmed by every kind of solemnity, have so penetrated into men's minds through their senses that, forgetting the ordinary conditions of life common to all, they look at themselves and everyone only from this conventional point of view, and are guided in their estimation of their own actions and those of others by this conventional standard. Thus, we see a man of perfect sanity and ripe age, simply because he is decked out with some fringe or embroidered keys on his coat tails, or a colored ribbon only fit for some gaily dressed girl, and is told that he is a general, a chamberlain, a knight of the Order of St. Andrew, or some similar nonsense, suddenly becomes self-important, proud, and even happy, or, on the contrary, grow melancholy and unhappy to the point of falling ill because he has failed to obtain the expected decoration or title. Or, what is still more striking, a young man, perfectly sane in every other matter, independent and beyond the fear of want, simply because he has been appointed judicial prosecutor or district commander, separates a poor widow from her little children and shuts her up in prison, leaving her children uncared for, all because the unhappy woman carried on a secret trade in spirits, and so deprived the revenue of 25 rubles. And he does not feel the least pang of remorse. Or what is still more amazing, a man otherwise sensible and good-hearted, simply because he is given a badge or a uniform to wear and told that he is a guard or customs officer, is ready to fire on people, and neither he nor those around him regard him as to blame for it, but, on the contrary, would regard him as to blame for it if he did not fire. To say nothing of judges and juries who condemn men to death, and soldiers who kill men by thousands without the slightest scruple, merely because it has been instilled into them that they are not simply men, but jurors, judges, generals, and soldiers. This strange and abnormal condition of men under state organization is usually expressed in the following words: As a man, I pity him, but as guard, judge, general, governor, czar, or soldier, it is my duty to kill or torture him. Just as though there were some positions conferred and recognized which would exonerate us from the obligations laid on each of us by the fact of our common humanity. So, for the example in the case before us, men are going to murder and torture the famishing, and they admit that in the dispute between the peasants and the landowner, the peasants are right. All those in command said as much to me. They know that the peasants are wretched, poor, and hungry, and the landowner is rich and inspires no sympathy. Yet, they are all going to kill the peasants to secure 3,000 rubles for the landowner, only because at that moment they fancy themselves not men, but governor, official, general of police, officer, and soldier, respectively, and consider themselves bound to obey not the eternal demands of the conscience of man, but the casual, temporary demands of their positions as officers or soldiers. Strange as it may seem, the sole explanation of this astonishing phenomenon is that they are in the condition of the hypnotized, who, they say, feel and act like the creatures they are commanded by the hypnotizer to represent. When, for instance, it is suggested to the hypnotized subject that he is lame, he begins to walk lame. That he is blind, he cannot see. That he is a wild beast, and he begins to bite. This is the state not only of those who are going to this expedition, but of all men who fulfill their state and social duties in preference to and in detriment of their human duties. The essence of this state is that under the influence of one suggestion, they lose their power of criticizing their actions and therefore do, without thinking, everything consistent with the suggestion to which they are led by example, precept, or insinuation. The difference between those hypnotized by scientific men and those under the influence of the state hypnotism is that an imaginary position is suggested to the former suddenly by one person in a very brief space of time, and so the hypnotized state appears to us in a striking and surprising form, while the imaginary position suggested by state influence is induced slowly, little by little, imperceptibly, from childhood, sometimes during years or even generations, and not by one person alone, but in a whole society. But it will be said, at all times, in all societies, the majority of persons, all the children, all the women absorbed in the bearing and rearing of the young, all the great mass of the laboring population who are under the necessity of incessant and fatiguing physical labor, all those of weak character by nature, all those who are abnormally enfeebled intellectually by the effects of nicotine, alcohol, opium, or other intoxicants, are always in a condition of incapacity for independent thought, and are either in subjugation to those who are on a higher intellectual level, or else under the influence of family or social traditions, of what is called public opinion, and there is nothing unnatural or incongruous in their subjugation. And truly there is nothing unnatural in it. And the tendency of men of small intellectual power to follow the lead of those on a higher level of intelligence is consistent law, and it is owing to it that men can live in societies and on the same principles at all. The minority consciously adopt certain rational principles through their correspondence with reason, while the majority act on the same principles unconsciously because it is required by public opinion. Such subjugation to public opinion on the part of the unintellectual does not assume an unnatural character till the public opinion is split into two. But there are times when a higher truth, revealed at first to a few persons, gradually gains ground till it has taken hold of such a number of persons that the old public opinion, founded on a lower order of truths, begins to totter, and the new is ready to take its place, but has not yet been firmly established. It is like the spring, this time of transition, when the old order of ideas has not quite broken up and the new has not quite gained a footing. Men begin to criticize their actions in the light of the new truth, but in the meantime, in practice, through inertia and tradition, they continue to follow the principles which once represented the highest point of rational consciousness, but are now in flagrant contradiction with it. Then men are in an abnormal, wavering condition, feeling the necessity of following the new ideal, and yet not bold enough to break with the old established traditions. Such is the attitude in regard to the truth of Christianity, not only of the men in the Tula train, but of the majority of men of our times, alike of the higher and the lower orders. Those of the ruling classes have no longer any reasonable justification for the profitable positions they occupy, are forced, in order to keep them, to stifle their higher rational faculty of loving, and to persuade themselves that their positions are indispensable, and those of the lower classes, exhausted by toil and brutalized of set purpose, are kept in a permanent deception practiced deliberately and continually by the higher classes upon them. Only in this way can one explain the amazing contradictions with which our life is full, and of which a striking example was presented to me by the expedition I met on the 9th of September. Good, peaceful men, known to me personally, going with untroubled tranquility to perpetrate the most beastly, senseless, and vile of crimes. Had not they some means of stifling their conscience? Not one of them would be capable of committing 100th part of such a villainy. It is not that they have not a conscience which forbids them from acting thus, just as even 300 or 400 years ago, when people burnt men at the stake and put them to the rack, they had a conscience which prohibited it. The conscience is there, but it has been put to sleep in those in command by what the psychologists call autosuggestion, in the soldiers by the direct conscious hypnotizing exerted by the higher classes. Though asleep, the conscience is there, and in spite of the hypnotism, it is already speaking in them, and it may awake. These men are in a position like that of a man under hypnotism, commanded to do something opposed to everything he regards as good and rational, such as to kill his mother or his child. The hypnotized subject feels himself bound to carry out the suggestion. He thinks he cannot stop, but the nearer he gets to that time and the place of the action, the more the benumbed conscience begins to stir, to resist, and to try to awake, and no one can say beforehand whether he will carry out the suggestion or not, which will gain the upper hand, the rational conscience or the irrational suggestion. It all depends on their relative strength. That is just the case with the men in the Tula train, and in general with everyone carrying out acts of state violence in our day. There was a time when men who set out with the object of murder and violence to make an example did not return till they had carried out their object, and then, untroubled by doubts or scruples, having calmly flogged men to death, they returned home and caressed their children, laughed, amused themselves, and enjoyed the peaceful pleasures of family life. In those days it never struck the landowners and wealthy men who profited by these crimes that the privileges they enjoyed had any direct connection with these atrocities. But now it is no longer so. Men know now, or are not far from knowing, what they are doing and for what object they do it. They can shut their eyes and force their conscience to be still, but so long as their eyes are opened and their conscience undulled, they must all, those who carry out and those who profit by these crimes alike, see the import of them. Sometimes they realize it only after the crime has been perpetrated. Sometimes they realize it just before its perpetration. Thus, those who commanded the recent acts of violence in Nizhny Novgorod, Saratov, Oriel, and the Uzinsky factory realized their significance only after their perpetration. And now those who command and those who carried out these crimes are ashamed before public opinion and their conscience. I have talked to soldiers who had taken part in these crimes, and they always studiously turned the conversation off the subject. And when they spoke of it, it was with horror and bewilderment. There are cases, too, when men come to themselves just before the perpetration of the crime. Thus, I know the case of a sergeant major who had been beaten by 2 peasants during the repression of disorder and had made a complaint. The next day, after seeing the atrocities perpetrated on the other peasants, he entreated the commander of his company to tear up his complaint and let off the 2 peasants. I know cases when soldiers commanded to fire have refused to obey, and I know many cases of officers who have refused to command expeditions for torture and murder, so that men sometimes come to their senses long before perpetrating the suggested crime, sometimes at the very moment before perpetrating it, sometimes only afterward. The men traveling in the Tula train were going with the object of killing and injuring their fellow creatures, but none could tell whether they would carry out their object or not. However obscure his responsibility for the affair is to each, and however strong the idea instilled into all of them that they are not men, but governors, officials, officers, and soldiers, and as such beings can violate every human duty, the nearer they approach the place of the execution, the stronger their doubts as to its being right, and this doubt will reach its highest point when the very moment for carrying it out has come. End of Chapter 12b. Recorded by David Shep, Los Angeles, California. Chapter 12c. The Kingdom of God is Within You. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by David Shep. The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. The governor, in spite of all the stupefying effect of his surroundings, cannot help hesitating when the moment comes to give the final decisive command. He knows that the action of the governor of Oriel has called down upon him the disapproval of the best people, and he himself, influenced by the public opinion of the circles in which he moves, has more than once expressed his disapprobation of him. He knows that the prosecutor, who ought to have come, flatly refused to have anything to do with it, because he regarded it as disgraceful. He knows, too, that there may be changes any day in the government, and that what was a ground for advancement yesterday may be the cause of disgrace tomorrow. And he knows that there is a press, if not in Russia, at least abroad, which may report the affair and cover him with ignominy forever. He is already conscious of a change in public opinion which condemns what was formerly a duty. Moreover, he cannot feel fully assured that his soldiers will at the last moment obey him. He is wavering, and none can say beforehand what he will do. All the officers and functionaries who accompany him experience in greater or less degree the same emotions. In the depths of their hearts, they all know what they are doing is shameful, that to take part in it is a discredit and blemish in the eyes of some people whose opinion they value. They know that after murdering and torturing the defenseless, each of them will be ashamed to face his betrothed or the woman he is courting, And besides, they too, like the governor, are doubtful whether the soldier's obedience to order can be reckoned on. What a contrast with the confident air they all put on as they sauntered about the station and platform. Inwardly they were not only in a state of suffering, but even of suspense. Indeed, they all assumed this bold and composed manner to conceal the wavering within, and this feeling increased as they drew near the scene of action. And imperceptible as it was, and strange as it seems to say so, all that mass of lads, the soldiers who seemed so submissive, were in precisely the same condition. These are not the soldiers of former days, who gave up the natural life of industry and devoted their whole existence to debauchery, plunder, and murder, like the Roman legionaries or the warriors of the 30 Years' War, or even the soldiers of more recent times who served for 25 years in the army. They have mostly been only lately taken from their families, and are full of the reconciliations of the good, rational, natural life they have left behind them. All these lads, peasants for the most part, know what is the business they have come about. They know that the landowner always oppresses their brothers and peasants, and that, therefore, it is most likely the same thing here. Moreover, a majority of them can now read, and the books they read are not all such as exalt a military life. There are some which point out its immorality. Among them are often free-thinking comrades who have enlisted voluntarily or young officers of liberal ideas, and already the first germ of doubt has been sown in regard to the unconditional legitimacy and glory of their occupation. It is true that they have all passed through the terrible, skillful education elaborated through centuries, which kills all initiative in a man, and that they are so trained to mechanical obedience that at the word of command, "Fire all the line! Fire!" and so on, their guns will rise themselves, and the habitual movements will be performed. But fire now does not mean shooting into the sand for amusement. It means firing on their broken down, exploited fathers and brothers whom they see there in the crowd, with women and children shouting and waving their arms. Here they are, one with his scanty beard and patched coat and plaited shoes of reed, just like the father they left at home in Kazan or Rizan province. One with gray beard and bent back, leaning on a staff like the old grandfather. One, a young fellow in boots and a red shirt, just as he was himself a year ago. He, the soldier, who must fire upon him. There, too, a woman in reed shoes and penova, just like the mother they left at home. Is it possible they must fire on them? And no one knows what each soldier will do at the last minute. The last word, the slightest allusion would be enough to stop them. At the last moment, they will all find themselves in the position of a hypnotized man to whom it has been suggested to chop a log, who, coming up to what has been indicated to them as a log, with the axe already lifted to strike, sees that it is not a log, but his sleeping brother. He may perform the act that has been suggested to him, and he may come to his senses at the last moment of performing it. In the same way, all these men may come to themselves in time, or they may go on to the end. If they do not come to themselves, the most fearful crime will be committed, as in Oriel, and then the hypnotic suggestion under which they act will be strengthened in all other men. If they do come to themselves, not only this terrible crime will not be perpetrated, but many also who hear of the turn the affair has taken will be emancipated from the hypnotic influence in which they were held, or at least will be nearer being emancipated from it. Even if a few only come to themselves and boldly explain to the others all the wickedness of such a crime, the influence of these few may rouse the others to shake off the controlling suggestion, and the atrocity will not be perpetrated. More than that, If a few men, even of those who are not taking part in the affair, but are only present at the preparations for it, or have heard of such things being done in the past, do not remain indifferent, but boldly and plainly express their detestation of such crimes to those who have to execute them, and point out to them all the senselessness, cruel wickedness of such acts, that alone will be productive of good. That was what took place in the instance before us. It was enough for a few men, some personally concerned in the affair and others simply outsiders, to express their disapproval of floggings that had taken place elsewhere, and their contempt and loathing for those who had taken part in inflicting them, for a few persons in the Tula case to express their repugnance to having any share in it, for a lady traveling by the train, and a few other bystanders at the station to express to those who formed the expedition their disgust at what they were doing, for one of the commanders of a company who had asked for troops for the restoration of order to reply that soldiers ought not to be butchers. And thanks to these and a few other seemingly insignificant influences brought to bear on these hypnotized men, the affair took a completely different turn, and the troops, when they reached the place, did not inflict any punishment, but contented themselves with cutting down the forest and giving it to the landowner. Had not a few persons had a clear consciousness that what they were doing was wrong, and consequently influenced one another in that direction, what was done in Oriel would have taken place at Tula. Had this consciousness still been stronger, and had the influence exerted been therefore greater than it was, it might well have been that the governor with his troops would not even have ventured to cut down the forest and give it to the landowner. Had the consciousness been stronger still, it might well have been that the governor would not have ventured to go to the scene of action at all, even that the minister would not have ventured to form this decision, or the Tsar to ratify it. All depends, therefore, on the strength of the consciousness of Christian truth on the part of each individual man. And therefore one would have thought that the efforts of all men of the present day who profess to wish to work for the welfare of humanity would have been directed to strengthening this consciousness of Christian truth in themselves and others. But, strange to say, it is precisely those people who profess most anxiety for the amelioration of human life, and are regarded as the leaders of public opinion, who assert that there is no need to do that, and that there are other more effective means for the amelioration of men's condition. They affirm that the amelioration of human life is effected not by the efforts of individual men to recognize and propagate the truth, but by the gradual modification of the general conditions of life, and that, therefore, the efforts of individuals should be directed to the gradual modification of external conditions for the better. For every advocacy of a truth inconsistent with the existing order by an individual is, they maintain, not only useless, but injurious, since it provokes coercive measures on the part of the authorities, restricting these individuals from continuing any action useful to society. According to this doctrine, all modifications in human life are brought about by precisely the same laws as in the life of the animals. So that, according to this doctrine, all the founders of religions, such as Moses and the prophets, Confucius, Lao Tse, Buddha, Christ, and others, preached their doctrines, and their followers accepted them, not because they loved the truth, but because the political, social, and, above all, economic conditions of the peoples among whom these religions arose were favorable for their origination and development, and therefore the chief efforts of the man who wishes to serve society and improve the condition of humanity ought, according to this doctrine, to be directed not to the elucidation and propagation of truth, but to the improvement of the external, political, social, and above all, economic conditions. And the modification of these conditions is partly effected by serving the government and introducing liberal and progressive principles into it, partly in promoting the development of industry and the propagation of socialistic ideas, and most of all, by the diffusion of science. According to this theory, it is of no consequence whether you profess the truth revealed to you and therefore realize it in your life, or at least refrain from committing actions opposed to the truth, such as serving the government and strengthening its authority when you regard it as injurious, profiting by the capitalistic system when you regard it as wrong, showing veneration for various ceremonies which you believe to be degrading superstitions, giving support to the law when you believe it to be founded on error, serving as a soldier, taking oaths, and lying, and lowering yourself generally. It is useless to refrain from all that. What is of use is not altering the existing forms of life, but submitting to them against your own convictions, introducing liberalism into the existing institutions, promoting commerce, the propaganda of socialism, and the triumphs of what is called science, and the diffusion of education. According to this theory, one can remain a landowner, merchant, manufacturer, judge, official in government pay, officer or soldier, and still be not only a humane man, but even a socialist and revolutionist. Hypocrisy, which had formerly only a religious basis in the doctrine of original sin, the redemption, and the church, has in our day gained a new scientific basis, and has consequently caught in its nets all those who had reached too high a stage of development to be able to find support in religious hypocrisy. So that while in former days a man who professed the religion of the church could take part in all the crimes of the state and profit by them, and still regard himself as free from any taint of sin, so long as he fulfilled the external observance of his creed. Nowadays, all who do not believe in the Christianity of the Church find similar, well-founded, irrefutable reasons in science for regarding themselves as blameless, and even highly moral in spite of their participation in the misdeeds of government and the advantages they gain from them. A rich landowner, not only in Russia, but in France, England, Germany, or America, lives on the rents exacted from the people living on his land, and robs these generally poverty-stricken people of all he can get from them. This man's right of property in the land rests on the fact that at every effort on the part of the oppressed people, without his consent, to make use of the land he considers his. Troops are called out to subject them to punishment and murder. One would have thought that it was obvious that a man living in his way was an evil, egotistical creature, and could not possibly consider himself a Christian or a liberal. One would have supposed evident that the first thing such a man must do if he wishes to approximate to Christianity or liberalism would be to cease to plunder and ruin men by means of acts of state violence in support of his claim to the land, and so it would be if it were not for the logic of hypocrisy, which reasons that from a religious point of view, possessions or non-possession of land is of no consequence for salvation, and from the scientific point of view, giving up the ownership of land is a useless individual renunciation, and that the welfare of mankind is not promoted in that way, but by a gradual modification of external forms. And so man, without the least trouble of mind or doubt, that people will believe in his sincerity, organizing an agricultural exhibition, or a temperance society, or sending some soup and stockings by his wife or children to 3 old women, and boldly in his family, in drawing rooms, in committees, and in the press, advocating the gospel or humanitarian doctrine of love for one's neighbor in general, and the agricultural laboring population in particular, whom he is continually exploiting and oppressing. The other people who are in the same position as he believe him, commend him, and solemnly discuss with him measures for ameliorating the condition of the working class, On those exploitations their whole life rests, devising all kinds of possible methods for this, except the one without which all improvement of their condition is impossible, i.e., refraining from taking from them the land necessary for their subsistence. A striking example of this hypocrisy was the solicitude displayed by the Russian landowners last year. Their efforts to combat the famine which they had caused, and by which they profited, selling not only bread at the highest price, but even potato haulm at 5 rubles the dozentine, about 2 4/5 acres, for fuel to the freezing peasants. Or take a merchant whose whole trade, like all trade indeed, is founded on a series of trickery, by means of which, profiting by the ignorance or need of others, he buys goods below their value and sells them again above their value. One would have fancied it obvious that a man whose whole occupation was based on what in his own language is called swindling, if it is done under other conditions, ought to be ashamed of his position, and could not any way, while he continues a merchant, profess himself a Christian or a liberal. But the sophistry of hypocrisy reasons that the man can pass for a virtuous man without giving up his pernicious course of action. A religious man need only have faith, and a liberal man need only promote the modification of external conditions, the progress of industry. And so we see the merchant, who often goes further and commits acts of direct dishonesty, selling adulterated goods, using false weights and measures, and trading in products injurious to health, such as alcohol and opium, boldly regarding himself as being regarded by others, so long as he does not directly deceive his colleagues in business, as a pattern of probity and virtue. And if he spends 1,000th part of his stolen wealth on some public institution, a hospital or museum or school, then he is even regarded as a benefactor of the people on the exploitation and corruption of whom his whole prosperity has been founded. If he sacrifices, too, a portion of his ill-gotten gains on a church and the poor, then he is an exemplary Christian. A manufacturer is a man whose whole income consists of value squeezed out of the workman, and whose whole occupation is based on forced, unnatural labor, exhausting whole generations of men. It would seem obvious that, if this man professes any Christian or liberal principles, he must first of all give up ruining human lives for his own profit. But, by the existing theory, he is promoting industry, and he ought not to abandon his pursuit. It would even be injuring society for him to do so. And so, we see this man, the harsh slave driver of thousands of men, building almshouses with little gardens 2 yards square for the workmen broken down and toiling for him, and a bank, and a poorhouse, and a hospital, fully persuaded that he has amply expiated in this way for all the human lives morally and physically ruined by him, and calmly going on with his business, taking pride in it. Any civil, religious, or military official in government employ who serves the state from vanity, or, as is most often the case, simply for the sake of the pay wrung from the harassed and toil-worn working classes, all taxes, however raised, always fall on labor. If he, as is very seldom the case, does not directly rob the government in the usual way, considers himself, as is considered by his fellows, as a most useful and virtuous member of society. A judge or a public prosecutor knows that through his sentence or his prosecution hundreds or thousands of poor wretches are at once torn from their families and thrown into prison, where they may go out of their minds, kill themselves with pieces of broken glass, or starve themselves. He knows that they have wives and mothers and children, disgraced and made miserable by separation from them, vainly begging for pardon for them or some alleviation of their sentence. And this judge, or this prosecutor, is so hardened in his hypocrisy that he and his fellows and his wife and his household are all fully convinced that he may be a most exemplary man. According to the metaphysics of hypocrisy, it is held that he is doing a work of public utility. And this man, who has ruined hundreds, thousands of men, who curse him and are driven to desperation by his action, goes to Mass, a smile of shining benevolence on his smooth face, in perfect faith in good and in God, listens to the gospel, caresses his children, preaches moral principles to them, and is moved by imaginary sufferings. All these men and those who depend on them, their wives, tutors, children, cooks, actors, jockeys, and so on, are living on the blood which by one means or another, through one set of bloodsuckers or another, is drawn out of the working class, and every day their pleasures cost hundreds or thousands of days of labor. They see the sufferings and privations of these labors, and their children, their aged, their wives, and their sick. They know the punishments inflicted on those who resist this organized plunder, and far from decreasing, far from concealing their luxury, they insolently display it before these oppressed laborers who hate them, as though intentionally provoking them with the pomp of their parks and palaces, their theaters, hunts, and races. At the same time, they continue to persuade themselves and others that they are all much concerned about the welfare of those working classes whom they have always trampled under their feet, and on Sundays, richly dressed, they drive in sumptuous carriages to the house of God built in very mockery of Christianity, and there listen to men, trained to this work of deception, who in white neckties or in brocaded vestments, according to their denomination, preach the love for their neighbor which they all gainsay in their lives. And these people have so entered into their part that they seriously believe that they really are what they pretend to be. The universal hypocrisy has so entered into the flesh and blood of all classes of our modern society, it has reached such a pitch that nothing in that way can rouse indignation. Hypocrisy in the Greek means acting, and acting, playing a part, is always possible. The representatives of Christ to the ranks and murderers, holding their guns loaded against their brothers for prayer, priests, ministers, and various Christian sects are always present, as indispensably as the hangman at executions, and sanction by their presence the compatibility of murder with Christianity. A clergyman assisted at the attempt at murder by electricity in America. But such facts cause no one any surprise. There was recently held at Petersburg an international exhibition of instruments of torture, handcuffs, models of solitary cells, that is to say, instruments of torture worse than knots or rods, and sensitive ladies and gentlemen went and amused themselves by looking at them. No one is surprised that together with its recognition of liberty, equality, and fraternity, liberal science should prove the necessity of war, punishment, customs, the censure, the regulation of prostitution, the exclusion of cheap foreign laborers, the hindrance of immigration, the justifiableness of colonization based on poisoning and destroying whole races of men called savages, and so on. People talk of the time when all men shall profess what is called Christianity, that is, various professions of faith hostile to one another, when all shall be well fed and clothed, when all shall be united from one end of the world to the other by telegraphs and telephones, and be able to communicate by balloons, when all the working classes are permeated by socialistic doctrines, when the trade unions possess so many millions of members and so many millions of rubles, when everyone is educated and all can read newspapers and learn all the sciences. But what good or useful thing can come of all these improvements if men do not speak or act in accordance with what they believe to be the truth. The condition of men is the result of their disunion. Their disunion results from their not following the truth, which is one, but falsehoods, which are many. The sole means of uniting men is their union in the truth, and therefore, the more sincerity men strive towards the truth, the nearer they get to unity. But how can men be united in the truth, or even approximate to it, if they do not even express the truth they know, but hold that there is no need to do so, and pretend to regard as truth what they believe to be false? And therefore, no improvement is possible so long as men are hypocritical and hide the truth from themselves, so long as they do not recognize that their union and therefore their welfare is only possible in the truth, and do not put the recognition and profession of the truth revealed to them higher than everything else. All the material improvements that religious and scientific men can dream of may be accomplished. All men may accept Christianity, and all the reforms desired by the Bellymans may be brought about with every possible addition and improvement. But if the hypocrisy which rules nowadays still exists, if men do not profess the truth they know, but continue to feign belief in what they do not believe, and veneration for what they do not respect, their condition will remain the same, or even grow worse and worse. The more men are freed from privation, the more telegraphs, telephones, books, papers, and journals there are, the more means there will be of diffusing inconsistent lies and hypocrisies, and the more disunited and consequently miserable will men become, which indeed is what we see actually taking place. All these material reforms may be realized, but the position of humanity will not be improved. But only let each man, according to his powers, at once realize in his life the truth he knows, or at least cease to support the falsehoods he is supporting in the place of the truth. And at once, in this year, 1893, we should see such reforms as we do not dare to hope for within a century, the emancipation of men and the reign of truth upon earth. Not without good reason was Christ's only harsh and threatening reproof directed against hypocrisies and hypocrisy. It is not theft or robbery, nor murder, nor fornication, but falsehood, the special falsehood of hypocrisy, which corrupts men, brutalizes them, and makes them vindictive, destroys all distinction between right and wrong in their conscience, deprives them of what is the true meaning of all real, and debars them from all progress towards perfection. Those who do evil through ignorance of the truth provoke sympathy with their victims and repugnance for their actions. They do harm only to those they attack, but those who know the truth and do evil masked by hypocrisy injure themselves and their victims, and thousands of other men as well who are led astray by the falsehood with which the wrongdoing is disguised. Thieves, robbers, murderers, and cheats who commit crimes recognized by themselves and everyone else as evil serve as an example of what ought not to be done, and deter others from similar crimes. But those who commit the same thefts, robberies, murders, and other crimes, disguising them under all kinds of religious or scientific or humanitarian justifications, as all landowners, merchants, manufacturers, and government officials do, provoke others to imitation, and so do harm not only to those who are directly the victims of their crimes, but to thousands and millions of men who they corrupt by obliterating their sense of the distinction between right and wrong. A single fortune gained by trading in goods necessary to the people, or in goods pernicious in their effects, or by financial speculations, or by acquiring land at a low price, the value of which is increased by the needs of the population, or by an industry ruinous to the health and life of those employed in it, or by military or civil service of the state, or by any employment which trades on men's evil instincts, a single fortune acquired in any of these ways, not only with the sanction, but even with the approbation of the leading men in society, and masked with an ostentation of philanthropy, corrupts men incomparably more than millions of thefts and robberies committed against the recognized forms of law and punishable as crimes. A single execution carried out by prosperous, educated men, uninfluenced by passion, with the approbation and assistance of Christian ministers, and represented as something necessary and even just, is infinitely more corrupting and brutalizing to men than thousands of murders committed by uneducated working people under the influence of passion. An execution such as was proposed by Jerkowski, which would produce even a sentiment of religious emotion in the spectators, would be one of the most perverting actions imaginable. See Volume 4 of the works of Jerkowski. Every war, even the most humanely conducted, with all its ordinary consequences, the destruction of harvests, robberies, the license and debauchery, and the murder with the justifications of its necessity and justice, the exaltation and glorification of military exploits, the worship of the flag, the patriotic sentiments, the feigned solicitude for the wounded, and so on, does more in 1 year to pervert men's minds than thousands of robberies, murders, and arsons perpetuated during hundreds of years by individual men under the influence of passion. The luxurious expenditure of a single respectable and so-called honorable family, even within the conventional limits, consuming as it does the produce of as many days of labor as would suffice to provide for thousands living in privation near, does more to pervert men's minds than thousands of the violent orgies and coarse tradespeople, officers and workmen of drunken and debauched habits, who smash up glasses and crockery for amusement. One solemn religious procession, one service, one sermon from the altar steps or the pulpit in which the preacher does not believe, produces incomparably more evil than thousands of swindling tricks, adulterations of food, and so on. We talk of the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, but the hypocrisy of our society far surpasses the comparatively innocent hypocrisy of the Pharisees. They had at least an external religion, the fulfillment of which hinders them from seeing their obligations to their neighbors. Moreover, these obligations were not nearly so clearly defined in their day. Nowadays, we have no such religious law to exonerate us from our duties to our neighbors. I am speaking now of the coarse and ignorant persons who still fancy their sins can be absolved by confession to a priest or by the absolution of the Pope. On the contrary, the law of the gospel, which we all profess in one form or another, directly defines these duties. Besides, the duties which had been then only vaguely and mystically expressed by a few prophets have now been so clearly formulated, have become such truisms, that they are repeated even by schoolboys and journalists, and so it would seem that men of today cannot pretend that they do not know these duties. A man of the modern world who profits by the order of things based on violence, and at the same time protests that he loves his neighbor and does not observe what he is doing in all his daily life to his neighbor, is like a brigand who has spent his life in robbing men, and who, caught at last, knife in hand, in the very act of striking his shrieking victim, should declare that he had no idea that what he was doing was disagreeable to the man he had robbed and was prepared to murder. Just as this robber and murderer could not deny what was evident to everyone, So it would seem that a man living upon the privations of the oppressed classes cannot persuade himself and others that he desires the welfare of those he plunders, and that he does not know how the advantages he enjoys are obtained. It is impossible to convince ourselves that we do not know that there are 100,000 men in prison in Russia alone to guarantee the security of our property and tranquility, and that we do not know of the law tribunals in which we take part, and which, at our initiative, condemn those who have attacked our property and our security to prison, exile, and forced labor, whereby men no worse than those who condemn them are ruined and corrupted, or that we do not know that we only possess all that we do possess because it has been acquired and is defended for us by murder and violence. We cannot pretend that we do not see the armed policeman who marches up and down beneath our windows to guarantee our security while we eat our luxurious dinner or look at the new piece at the theater, or that we are unaware of the existence of the soldiers who will make their appearance with guns and cartridges directly our property is attacked. We know very well that we are only allowed to go on eating our dinner, to finish seeing the new play, or to enjoy to the end the ball, the Christmas fete, the promenade, the races, or the hunt, thanks to the policeman's revolver or the soldier's rifle, which will shoot down the famished outcast who has been robbed of his share, and who looks round the corner with covetous eyes at our pleasures, ready to interpret them instantly. Were not the policeman and the soldier there prepared to run up at our first call for help? And therefore, just as a brigand caught in broad daylight in the act cannot persuade us that he did not lift his knife in order to rob his victim of his purse and had no thought of killing him, we too, it would seem, cannot persuade ourselves or others that the soldiers and policemen around us are not to guard us, but only for defense against foreign foes, and to regulate traffic and fetes and reviews. We cannot persuade ourselves and others that we do not know that men do not like dying of hunger, bereft of the right to gain their subsistence from the earth on which they live, that they do not like working underground, in the water, or in stifling heat, for 10 to 14 hours a day, at night in factories to manufacture objects for our pleasure. One would imagine it impossible to deny what is so obvious. Yet it is denied. Still, there are, among the rich, especially among the young, and among women, persons whom I am glad to meet more and more frequently, who, when they are shown in what way and at what cost their pleasures are purchased, do not try to conceal the truth, but, hiding their head in their hands, cry, "Oh, don't speak of that. If it is so, life is impossible." But though there are such sincere people who, even though they cannot renounce their fault, at least see it, the vast majority of the men of the modern world have so entered into the parts they play in their hypocrisy that they boldly deny what is staring everyone in the face. All that is unjust, they say. No one forces the people to work for the landowners and manufacturers. That is an affair for free contract. Great properties and fortunes are necessary because they provide an organized work for the working classes, and labor in the factories and workshops is not at all the terrible thing you make it out to be, even if there are some abuses in factories. The government and the public are taking steps to obviate them and to make the labor of the factory workers much easier and even agreeable. The working classes are accustomed to physical labor and are, so far, fit for nothing else. The poverty of the people is not the result of private property in land, nor of capitalistic oppression, but of other causes. It is the result of the ignorance, brutality, and intemperance of the people. And we men in authority who are striving against this impoverishment of the people by wise legislation, we capitalists who are combating it by the extension of useful inventions, we clergymen by religious instruction, and we liberals by the formation of trade unions and the diffusion of education, are in this way increasing the prosperity of the people without changing our own positions. We do not want all to be as poor as the poor. We want all to be as rich as the rich. As for the assertion that men are ill-treated and murdered to force them to work for the profit of the rich, that is a sophism. The army is only called out against the mob when the people, in ignorance of their own interests, make disturbances and destroy the tranquility necessary for the public welfare. In the same way, too, it is necessary to keep in restraint the malefactors for whom the prisons and gallows are established. We ourselves wish to suppress these forms of punishment and are working in that direction. Hypocrisy in our day is supported on two sides, by false religion and by false science, and it has reached such proportions that if we were not living in the midst, we could not believe that men could attain such a pitch of self-deception. Men of the present day have come into such an extraordinary condition, their hearts are so hardened, that seeing they see not, hearing they do not hear, and understand not. Men have long been living in antagonism to their conscience. If it were not for hypocrisy, they could not go on living such a life. The social organization in opposition to their conscience only continues to exist because it is disguised by hypocrisy. And the greater the divergence between actual life and men's conscience, the greater the extension of hypocrisy. But even hypocrisy has its limits, and it seems to me that we have reached those limits in the present day. Every man of the present day with the Christian principles assimilated involuntarily in his conscience finds himself in precisely the position of a man asleep who dreams that he is obliged to do something which, even in his dream, he knows he ought not to do. He knows this in the depths of his conscience, and all the same he seems unable to change his position. He cannot stop and cease doing what he ought not to do. And just as in a dream, his position, becoming more and more painful, at last reaches such a pitch of intensity that he begins sometimes to doubt the reality of what is passing, and makes a moral effort to shake off the nightmare which is oppressing him. This is just the condition of the average man of our Christian society. He feels that all that he does himself and that is done around him is something absurd, hideous, impossible, and opposed to his conscience. He feels that his position is becoming more and more unendurable and reaching a crisis of intensity. It is not possible that we modern men, with the Christian sense of human dignity and equality permeating us soul and body, with our need for peaceful association and unity between nations, should really go on living in such a way that every joy, gratification we have is bought by the sufferings, by the lives of our brother men, and moreover, that we should be every instant within a hair's breadth of falling on one another, nation against nation, like wild beasts, mercilessly destroying men's lives and labor, only because some benign diplomat or ruler says or writes some stupidity to another equally benign diplomat or ruler. It is impossible. Yet every man of our day sees that this is so, and awaits the calamity. And the situation becomes more and more insupportable. And as men who is dreaming does not believe that what appears to him can be truly the reality and tries to wake up from the actual real world again. So the average man of modern days cannot, in the bottom of his heart, believe that the awful position in which he is placed, and which is growing worse and worse, can be the reality, and tries to wake up to a true, real life, as it exists in his conscience. And just as the dreamer needs only make a moral effort and ask himself, "Isn't it a dream?" and the situation which seemed to him so hopeless will instantly disappear, and he will wake up to peaceful and happy reality. So the man of the modern world need only make a moral effort to doubt the reality presented to him by his own hypocrisy and the general hypocrisy around him, and to ask himself, "Isn't it all a delusion?" And he will at once, like the dreamer awakened, feel himself transported from an imaginary and dreadful world to the true, calm, and happy reality. And to do this, a man need accomplish no great feats or exploits. He need only make a moral effort. But can a man make this effort? According to the existing theory so essential to support hypocrisy, man is not free and cannot change his life. Man cannot change his life because he is not free. He is not free because all his actions are conditioned by previously existing causes, and whatever the man may do, there are always some causes or other through which he does these or those acts, and therefore man cannot be free and change his life, say the champions of the metaphysics of hypocrisy. And they would be perfectly right if man were a creature without conscience and incapable of moving toward the truth. That is to say, if after recognizing a new truth, man always remained at the same stage of moral development, but man is a creature with a conscience and capable of attaining a higher and higher degree of truth. And therefore, even if man is not free as regards performing these or those acts, because there exists a previous cause for every act, the very causes of the acts, consisting as they do for the man of conscience of the recognition of this or that truth, are within his own control. So that though man may not be free as regards the performance of his actions, he is free as regards the foundation on which they are performed. Just as the mechanician who is not free to modify the movement of his locomotive when it is in motion is free to regulate the machine beforehand so as to determine what the movement is to be. Whatever the conscious man does, he acts just as he does, and not otherwise, only because he recognizes that to act as he is acting is in accord with the truth, or because he has recognized it at some previous time, and is now only through inertia, through habit, acting in accordance with his previous recognition of truth. In any case, the cause of his action is not to be found in any given previous fact, but in the consciousness of a given relation to truth, and the consequent recognition of this or that fact as a sufficient basis for action. Whether a man eats or does not eat, works or rests, runs, risks, or avoids them, if he has a conscience, he acts thus only because he considers it right and rational, because he considers that to act thus is in harmony with truth, or else because he has made this reflection in the past. The recognition or non-recognition of a certain truth depends not on external causes, but on certain other causes within the man himself, so that at times under external conditions apparently very favorable for the recognition of truth, one man will not recognize it, and another, on the contrary, under the most unfavorable conditions, will, without apparent cause, recognize it. As it is said in the Gospel, "No man can come unto me except the Father which hath sent me draw him." That is to say,
The recognition of truth, which is the cause of all the manifestations of human life, does not depend on external phenomena, but on certain inner spiritual characteristics of the man which escape our observation. And therefore man, though not free in his acts, always feels himself free in what is the motive of his acts, the recognition or non-recognition of truth. And he feels himself independent not only of facts external to his own personality, but even of his own actions. Thus, a man who, under the influence of passion, has committed an act contrary to the truth he recognizes, remains nonetheless free to recognize it or not to recognize it. That is, he can, by refusing to recognize the truth, regard his action as necessary and justifiable, or he may recognize the truth and regard his act as wrong, and censure himself for it. Thus, a gambler or a drunkard who does not resist temptation and yields to his passion is still free to recognize gambling and drunkenness as wrong, or to regard them as a harmless pastime. In the first case, even if he does not at once get over his passion, he gets the more free from it, the more sincerely he recognizes the truth about it. In the second case, he will be strengthened in his vice and will deprive himself of every possibility of shaking it off. In the same way, a man who has made his escape alone from a house on fire, not having had the courage to save his friend, remains free, recognizing the truth that a man ought to save the life of another, even at the risk of his own, to regard his action as bad and to censure himself for it, or, not recognizing this truth, to regard his action as natural and necessary and to justify it to himself. In the first case, if he recognizes the truth in spite of his departure from it, he prepares for himself in the future a whole series of acts of self-sacrifice necessarily flowing from this recognition of the truth. In the second case, a whole series of egotistic acts. Not that a man is always free to recognize or to refuse to recognize every truth. There are truths which he has recognized long before, or which have been handed down to him by education and tradition, and accepted by him on faith, and to follow these truths has become a habit, a second nature within him. And there are truths only vaguely, as it were distantly apprehended by him. The man is not free to refuse to recognize the first, nor to recognize the second class of truths. But there are truths of a third kind, which have not yet become an unconscious motive of action, but yet have been revealed so clearly to him that he cannot pass them by, and is inevitably obliged to do one thing or the other, to recognize or not to recognize them. And it is in regard to these truths that the man's freedom manifests itself. Every man during his life finds himself in regard to truth in the position of a man walking in the darkness with light thrown before him by the lantern he carries. He does not see what is not yet lighted up by the lantern. He does not see what he has passed, which is hidden in the darkness. But at every stage of his journey, he sees what is lighted up by the lantern, and he can always choose one side or the other of the road. There are always unseen truths not yet revealed to the man's intellectual vision, and there are other truths outlived, forgotten, and assimilated by him. And there are also certain truths that rise up before the light of his reason and require his recognition. And it is in the recognition or non-recognition of these truths that what we call his freedom is manifested. All the difficulty and seeming insolubility of the question of the freedom of man results from those who tried to solve the question imagining man statutory in his relation to the truth. Man is certainly not free if we imagine him stationary, and if we forget that the life of a man and of humanity is nothing but a continual movement from darkness into light, from a lower stage of truth to a higher, from a truth more alloyed with errors to a truth more purified from them. Man would not be free if he knew no truth at all, and in the same way he would not be free and would not even have any idea of freedom if the whole truth which was to guide him in life had been revealed once for all to him in all its purity, without any admixture of error. But man is not stationary in regard to truth, but every individual man, as he passes through life and humanity as a whole, in the same way, is continually learning to know a greater and greater degree of truth, and growing more and more free from error. And therefore men are in a threefold relation to truth. Some truths have been so assimilated by them that they have become the unconscious basis of action. Others are only just on the point of being revealed to him, and a third class, though not yet assimilated by him, have been revealed to him with sufficient clearness to force him to decide either to recognize them or to refuse to recognize them. These, then, are the truths which man is free to recognize or to refuse to recognize.
End of chapter 12c. Chapter 12d. The Kingdom of God is Within You. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by David Shep. The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Constance Garnett. The liberty of man does not consist in the power of acting independently of the progress of life and the influences arising from it, but in the capacity for recognizing and acknowledging the truth revealed to him, and becoming the free and joyful participator in the eternal and infinite work of God. The life of the world, or, on the other hand, for refusing to recognize the truth and so being a miserable and reluctant slave, dragged whither he has no desire to go. Truth not only points out the way along which human life ought to move, but reveals also the only way along which it can move, and therefore all men must willingly or unwillingly move along the way of truth, some spontaneously accomplishing the task set them in life, others submitting involuntarily to the law of life. Man's freedom lies in the power of his choice. This freedom, within these narrow limits, seems so insignificant to men that they do not notice it. Some, the determinists, consider this amount of freedom so trifling that they do not recognize it at all. Others, the champions of complete free will, keep their eyes fixed on their hypothetical free will and neglect this which seemed to them such a trivial degree of freedom. This freedom, confined between the limits of complete ignorance of the truth and a recognition of a part of the truth, seems hardly freedom at all, especially since, whether a man is willing or unwilling to recognize the truth revealed to him, he will be inevitably forced to carry it out in life. A horse harnessed with others to a cart is not free to refrain from moving the cart. If he does not move forward, the cart will knock him down and go on dragging him with it, whether he will or not. But the horse is free to drag the cart himself, or to be dragged with it, and so it is with man. Whether this is a great or small degree of freedom in comparison with the fantastic liberty we should like to have, it is the only freedom that really exists, and in it consists the only happiness attainable by man. And more than that, this freedom is the sole means of accomplishing the divine work of the life of the world.
According to Christ's doctrine, the man who sees the significance of life in the domain in which it is not free, in the domain of effects, that is, of acts, has not the true life. According to the Christian doctrine, that man is living in the truth who has transported his life to the domain in which it is free, the domain of causes, that is, the knowledge and recognition, the profession and realization in life of revealed truth. Devoting his life to works with the flesh, a man busies himself with the actions depending on temporary causes outside himself. He himself does nothing, really. He merely seems to be doing something. In reality, all the acts which seem to be his are the work of a higher power, and he is not the creator of his own life, but the slave of it. Devoting his life to the recognition and fulfillment of the truth revealed to him, he identifies himself with the source of universal life and accomplishes acts not personal and dependent on conditions of space and time, but acts unconditioned by previous causes, acts which constitute the causes of everything else and have an infinite, unlimited significance. The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violent take it by force. Matt 10:12. It is this violent effort to rise above external conditions to the recognition and realization of truth by which the kingdom of heaven is taken, and it is this effort of violence which must and can be made in our times. Men need only understand this. They need only cease to trouble themselves about the general external conditions in which they are not free, and devote 1/100th part of the energy they waste on those material things to that in which they are free, to the recognition and realization of the truth which is before them, and to the liberation of themselves and others from deception and hypocrisy, and, without effort or conflict, there would be an end at once of the false organization of life which makes men miserable and threatens them with worse calamities in the future. And then the kingdom of God would be realized, or at least that first stage of it, for which men are ready now by the degree of development of their conscience. Just as a single shock may be sufficient, when a liquid is saturated with some salt, to precipitate it at once in crystals, a slight effort may be perhaps all that is needed now, that the truth already revealed to men may gain a mystery over hundreds, thousands, millions of men, that a public opinion consistent with conscience may be established, and through this change of public opinion, the whole order of life may be transformed, and it depends on us to make this effort. Let's stand and accept the Christian truth, which in the most varied forms surrounds us on all sides and forces itself upon us. Let us only cease from lying and pretending that we do not see this truth or wish to realize it, at least in what it demands from us above all else. Only let us accept and boldly profess the truth to which we are called, and we should find at once that hundreds, thousands, millions of men are in the same position as we, that they see truth as we do, and dread, as we do, to stand alone in recognizing it, and like us, are only waiting for others to recognize it also. Only let men cease to be hypocrites, and they would at once see that this cruel social organization, which holds them in bondage and is represented to them as something stable, necessary, and ordained of God, is already tottering and is only propped up by the falsehood of hypocrisy with which we, and others like us, support it. But if this is so, if it is true that it depends on us to break down the existing organization of life, have we the right to destroy it without knowing clearly what we shall set up in its place? What will become of human society when the existing order of things is at an end? What shall we find the other side of the walls of the world we are abandoning. Fear will come upon us, a void, a vast emptiness, freedom. How are we going to go forward not knowing whither, how face loss, not seeing hope of gain? If Columbus had reasoned thus, he would never have weighed anchor. It was madness to set off upon the ocean, not knowing the route, on the ocean on which no one had sailed, to sail toward a land whose existence was doubtful. But this madness, he discovered a new world. Doubtless, if the peoples of the world could simply transfer themselves from one furnished mansion to another and better one, it would make it much easier. But, unluckily, there is no one to get humanity's new dwelling ready for it. The future is even worse than the ocean. There is nothing there. It will be what men and circumstances make it. If you are content with the old world, try to preserve it. It is very sick and cannot hold out much longer, but if you cannot bear to live in everlasting dissonance between your beliefs and your life, thinking one thing and doing another, get out of the medieval whitened sepulchres and face your fears. I know very well it is not easy. It is not a little thing to cut oneself off from all to which a man has been accustomed from his birth, with which he has grown up to maturity. Men are ready for tremendous sacrifices, but not for those in which life demands of them. Are they ready to sacrifice modern civilization, their manner of life, their religion, the received conventional morality? Are we ready to give up all the results we have attained with such effort, results of which we have been boasting for 3 centuries? To give up every convenience and charm of our existence, to prefer savage youth to the senile decay of civilization, to pull down the palace raised for us by our ancestors only for the pleasure of having a hand in the founding of a new house, which will doubtless be built long after we are gone. Thus wrote, almost half a century ago, the Russian writer who with prophetic insight saw clearly then what even the most unreflecting man sees today. The impossibility, that is, of life continuing on its old basis, and the necessity of establishing new forms of life. It is clear now, from the very simplest, most commonplace point of view, that it is madness to remain under the roof of a building which cannot support its weight, and that we must leave it. And indeed it is difficult to imagine a position more wretched than that of the Christian world today, with its nations armed against one another, with its constantly increasing taxation to maintain its armies, with the hatred of the working class for the rich ever growing more intense, with the Damocles sword of war for heads of all, ready every instant to fall, certain to fall, sooner or later. Hardly could any revolution be more disastrous for the great mass of the population than the present order, or rather disorder, of our life. With its daily sacrifices to exhausting and unnatural toil, to poverty, drunkenness, and profligacy, with all the horrors of the war that is at hand, which will swallow up in 1 year more victims than all the revolutions of the century. What will become of humanity if each of us performs the duty God demands of us through the conscience implanted within us? Will not harm cometh? Being wholly in the power of the Master, I carry out in the workshop erected and directed by him the orders he gives me, strange though they may seem to me who do not know the Master's final aims. But it is not even this question, what will happen, that agitates men when they hesitate to fulfill the Master's will. They are troubled by the question how to live without those habitual conditions of life which we call civilization, culture, art, and science. We feel ourselves all the burdensomeness of life as it is. We see also that this organization of life must inevitably be our ruin, if it continues. At the same time, we want the conditions of our life which arise out of the organization, our civilization, culture, art, and science, to remain intact. It is as though a man living in an old house and suffering from cold and all sorts of inconvenience in it, knowing, too, that it is on the point of falling to pieces, should consent to its being rebuilt, but only on condition that he should not be required to leave it. A condition which is equivalent to refusing to have it rebuilt at all. But what if I leave the house and give up every convenience for a time, and the new house is not built, or is built on a different plan, so that I do not find it the comforts to which I am accustomed? But seeing that the materials and the builders are here, there is very likelihood that our new house will, on the same contrary, be better built than the old one. And at the same time, there is not only the likelihood, but the certainty that the old house will fall down and crush those who remain within it. Whether the old habitual conditions of life are supported, or whether they are abolished and altogether new and better, conditions arise. In any case, there is no doubt we shall be forced to leave the old forms of life which have become impossible and fatal, and must go forward to meet the future. Civilization, art, science, culture will disappear. Yes. But all these we know are only various manifestations of truth, and the change that is before us is only to be made for the sake of a closer attainment and realization of truth. How, then, can manifestations of truth disappear through our realizing it? These manifestations will be different, higher, better, but they will not cease to be. Only what is false in them will be destroyed. All the truth there was in them will only be stronger and more flourishing. Take thought, O men, and have faith in the gospel, in whose teaching is your happiness. If you do not take thought, you will perish, just as the man perished, slain by Pilate, or crushed by the tower of Salem. As millions of men have perished, slayers and slain, executing and executed, torturers and tortured alike. And as the man foolishly perished, who fills his granaries full, and made ready for a long life, and died the very night that he planned to begin his life. Take thought and have faith in the gospel. Christ said enlightened 100 years ago, and he says it with even greater force now, that the calamities foretold by him have come to pass, and the senselessness of our life has reached the furthest point of suffering and madness. After so many centuries of fruitless efforts to make our life secure by the pagan organization of life, it must be evident to everyone that all efforts in that direction only introduce fresh dangers into personal and social life, and do not render it more secure in any way. Whatever names we dignify ourselves with, whatever uniforms we wear, whatever priests we anoint ourselves before, however many millions we possess, however many guards are stationed along our road, however many policemen guard our wealth, however many so-called criminals, revolutionists, and anarchists we punish, whatever exploits we have performed, whatever states we have founded, fortresses and towers we may have erected, from Babel to the Eiffel Tower, there are two inevitable conditions of life confronting all of us, which destroy its whole meaning. 1. Death, which may at any moment pounce upon each of us. And 2. the transitoriness of all our works, which so soon pass away and leave no trace. Whatever we may do, found companies, build palaces and monuments, write songs and poems, it is all not for long time. Soon it passes away, leaving no trace, and therefore, however we may conceal it from ourselves, we cannot help seeing that the significance of our life cannot lie in our personal fleshy existence, the prey of incurable suffering and inevitable death, nor in any social institution or organization. Whoever you may be who are reading these lines, think of your position and of your duties. Not of your position as landowner, merchant, judge, emperor, president, minister, priest, soldier, which has been temporarily allotted to you by men, and not of your imaginary duties laid on you by those positions, but of your real position in eternity as a creature who, at the will of someone, has been called out of unconsciousness after an eternity of non-existence, to which you may return at any moment at his will. Think of your duties. Not your supposed duties as a landowner to your estate, as a merchant to your business, as an emperor, minister, or official to the state, but of your real duties, the duties that follow from your real position as a being called into life and endowed with reason and love. Are you doing what he demands of you, who has sent you into the world, and to whom you will soon return? Are you doing what he wills? Are you doing his will when, as a landowner or manufacturer, you rob the poor of the fruits of their toil, basing your life on this plunder of the workers? Or when, as judge or governor, you ill-treat men, sentence them to execution, or when, as soldiers, you prepare for war, kill, and plunder? You will say that the world is so made that this is inevitable, and that you do not do this of your own free will, but because you are forced to do so. But can it be that you have such a strong aversion to men's sufferings, ill-treatment, and murder, that you have such an intense need of love and cooperation with your fellows, that you see clearly that only by the recognition of the equality of all, and by mutual services, can the greatest possible happiness be realized? That your head and your heart, the faith you profess, and even science itself tell you the same thing, and yet that in spite of it all, you can be forced by some confused and complicated reasoning to act in direct opposition to all this. That as landowner or capitalist, you are bound to base your whole life on the oppression of the people. That as emperor or president, you are to command armies, that is, to be the head of commander of murderers. Or that as government official, you are forced to take from the poor their last pence for rich men to profit and share them among themselves. Or that as judge or journeyman, you could be forced to sentence erring men to ill treatment and death because the truth was not revealed to them. Or above all, for that is the basis of all the evil, that you could be forced to become a soldier and, renouncing your free will and your human sentiments, could undertake to kill anyone at the command of other men? It cannot be. Even if you are told that all this is necessary for the maintenance of the existing order of things, and that this social order, with its pauperism, faminists, prisons, gallows, armies, and wars, is necessary to society, that still greater disasters would ensure if this organization were destroyed. All that is said only by those who profit by this organization, while those who suffer from it and they are 10 times as numerous, think and say quite the contrary. And at the bottom of your heart, you know yourself that it is not true, that the existing organization has outlived its time and must inevitably be reconstructed on new principles, and that consequently there is no obligation upon you to sacrifice your sentiments of humanity to support it. Above all, even if you allow that this organization is necessary, why do you believe it to be your duty to maintain it at the cost of your best feelings? Who has made you the nurse in charge of this sick and morbid organization? Not society, nor the state, nor anyone. No one has asked you to undertake this. You will fulfill your position of landowner, merchant, czar, priest, or soldier. Know very well that you occupy that position by no means with the unselfish aim of maintaining the organization of life necessary to men's happiness, but simply in your own interests to satisfy your own covetousness, or vanity, or ambition, or indolence, or cowardice. If you did not desire that position, you would not be doing your utmost to retain it. Try the experiment of ceasing to commit the cruel, treacherous, and base actions that you are constantly committing in order to retain your position, and you will lose it at once. Try this simple experiment as a government official of giving up lying and refusing to take a part in executions and acts of violence, as a priest of giving up deception, as a soldier of giving up murder, as a landowner or manufacturer of giving up defending your property by fraud and force, and you will at once lose the position which you pretend is forced upon you and which seems burdensome to you. A man cannot be placed against his will in a situation opposed to his conscience. If you find yourself in such a position, it is not because it is necessary to anyone whatever, but simply because you wish it. And therefore, knowing that your position is repugnant to your heart and your head, and to your faith, and even to the science in which you believe, you cannot help reflecting upon the question whether in retaining it, and above all, trying to justify it, you are doing what you ought to do. You might risk making a mistake if you had time to see and retrieve your fault, and if you ran the risk of something of some value. But when you know beyond all doubt that you may disappear any minute without the least possibility, either for yourself or those you draw after you, into your error of retrieving the mistake. When you know that whatever you may do in the external organization of life, it will all disappear as quickly and surely as you will yourself, and will leave no trace behind, it is clear that you have no reasonable ground for running the risk of such a fearful mistake. It would be perfectly simple and clear if you did not by your hypocrisy disguise the truth which has so unmistakably been revealed to us. Share all that you have with others. Do not heap up riches. Do not steal. Do not cause suffering. Do not kill. Do not unto others what you would not they should do unto you. All that has been said, not 1800, but 5,000 years ago, and there could be no doubt of the truth of this law, if it were not for hypocrisy. Except for hypocrisy, men could not have failed, if not to put the law in practice, at least to recognize it and admit that it is wrong not to put into practice. But you will say that there is the public good to be considered, and that on that account one must not and ought not to conform to these principles. For the public good, one may commit acts of violence and murder. It is better for one man to die than that the whole people perish. You will say, like Caiaphas, and you will sign the sentence of death of one man, of a second, and a third. You load your gun against this man who is to perish for the public good. You imprison him. You take his possessions. You say that you commit these acts of cruelty because you are a part of the society and of the state, that it is your duty to serve them, and as landowner, judge, emperor, or soldier, to conform to their laws. But besides belonging to the state and having duties created by that position, you belong also to eternity and to God, who also lays duties upon you. And just as your duties to your family and to society are subordinate to your superior duties to the state, in the same way, the latter must necessarily be subordinated to the duties dictated to you by the eternal life and by God. And just as it would be senseless to pull up the telegraph posts for fuel for a family or society and thus to increase its welfare at the expense of public interests, in the same way it is senseless to do violence, to execute, and to murder, to increase the welfare of the nation, because that is at the expense of the interests of humanity. Your duties as a citizen cannot but be subordinated to the superior obligations of the eternal life of God, and cannot be in position to them. As Christ's disciples said 18 centuries ago, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye. Acts 4:19. And we ought to obey God rather than man. Acts 5:29. It is asserted that, in order that the unstable order of things established in one corner of the world for a few men may not be destroyed, you ought to commit acts of violence which destroy the eternal and immutable order established by God and by reason. Can that possibly be? And therefore you cannot but reflect on your position as landowner, manufacturer, judge, emperor, president, minister, priest, and soldier, which is bound up with violence, deception, and murder, and recognize its unlawfulness. I do not say that if you are a landowner, you are bound to give up your lands immediately to the poor. If a capitalist or manufacturer, your money to the workpeople. Or that if you are czar, minister, official, judge, or general, you are bound to renounce immediately the advantages of your position. Or if a soldier, on whom all the system of violence is based, to refuse immediately to obey in spite of all the dangers of insubordination. If you do so, you will be doing the best thing possible, but it may happen, and it is most likely that you will not have the strength to do so. You have relations, a family, subordinates, and superiors. You are under an influence so powerful that you cannot shake it off. But you can always recognize the truth and refuse to tell a lie about it. You need not declare that you are remaining a landowner, manufacturer, merchant, artist, or writer because it is useful to mankind, that you are governor, prosecutor, or czar, not because it is agreeable to you, because you are used to it, but for the public good. That you continue to be a soldier, not from fear of punishment, but because you consider the army necessary to society. You can always avoid lying in this way to yourself and to others. And you ought to do so, because the one aim of your life ought to be to purify yourself from falsehood and to confess the truth. And you need only do that, and your situation will change directly of itself. There is one thing, and only one thing, in which it is guaranteed you to be free in life, all else being beyond your power. That is to recognize and profess the truth. And yet, simply from the fact that other men, as misguided, as pitiful creatures as yourself, have made you soldier, czar, landowner, capitalist, priest, or general, you undertake to commit acts of violence obviously opposed to your reason and your heart, to base your existence on the misfortunes of others, and above all, instead of fulfilling the one duty of your life, recognizing and professing the truth, you feign not to recognize it and disguise it from yourself and others. And what are the conditions in which you are doing this? You who may die any instant. You sign sentences of death. You declare war. You take part in it. You judge, you punish, you plunder the working people. You live luxuriously in the midst of the poor, and teach weak men who have confidence in you that this must be so, that the duty of men is to do this, and yet it may happen at the moment when you are acting thus, that a bacterium or a bull may attack you, and you will fall and die, losing forever the chance of repairing the harm you have done to others, and above all, to yourself, in uselessly wasting a life which has been given you only once in eternity, without having accomplished the only thing you ought to have done. However commonplace and out of date it may seem to us, however confused we may be by hypocrisy and by the hypnotic suggestion which results from it, nothing can destroy the certainty of this simple and clearly defined truth. No external conditions can guarantee our life, which is attended with inevitable sufferings and infallibility terminated by death, and which consequently can have no significance except in the constant accomplishment of what is demanded by the power which has placed us in life with a sole certain guide, the rational conscience. That is why that power cannot require of us its irrational and impossible, the organization of our temporary external life, the life of society or of the state. That power demands of us only what is reasonable, certain, and possible, to serve the kingdom of God. That is, to contribute to the establishment of the greatest possible union between all living things, a union possible only in truth, and to recognize and to profess the revealed truth, which is always in our power. But seek ye first the kingdom of God, and this righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Matthew 6:33. The sole meaning of life is to serve humanity by contributing to the establishment of the kingdom of God, which can only be done by the recognition and profession of the truth by every man. The kingdom of God cometh not with outward show, neither shall they say, Lo here, or lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you. Luke 17:20-21. End of chapter 12D. Recorded by David Shep, Los Angeles, California. End of The Kingdom of God is